Everyone knows Hitler lost the war. But what if I told you the real reasons had nothing to do with the battles you learned about in school? See, we all hear about D-Day, Stalingrad, and the Battle of Britain. Those are the big moments everyone points to. But there were decisions made years before those battles that guaranteed Germany would lose. Choices so stupid, so short-sighted, that even Hitler's own generals were shaking their heads in disbelief. And the craziest part? Most people have never even heard of these mistakes. They're buried in declassified documents, personal diaries, and testimony from generals who survived the war. These aren't just tactical errors on a battlefield. These are fundamental miscalculations that reveal how Hitler's own delusions and paranoia destroyed any chance Germany had at winning. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the war was actually lost before it even really began. And trust me, some of these decisions are so unbelievably dumb that you'll wonder how anyone took this guy seriously in the first place. So before we dive into these 10 massive screw-ups, we need to understand something important about Hitler's mindset. This guy wasn't just evil. He was also incredibly disconnected from reality. And that combination turned out to be absolutely catastrophic for Germany. Hitler believed in something called willpower over reality. Basically, he thought that if you wanted something badly enough, and if your racial ideology was superior enough, then facts and logistics didn't matter. You could just will yourself to victory. Sounds insane, right? Well, it was. And this belief system led to some of the most mind-bogglingly stupid decisions in military history. Now, a lot of these miscalculations were hidden for decades. After the war, German generals wrote memoirs where they basically blamed everything on Hitler to save their own reputations. And while Hitler definitely deserves a ton of blame, the truth is more complicated. Some of these mistakes were Hitler going directly against expert advice. Others were cases where his generals were too scared to tell him the truth. And a few were situations where everyone involved was so caught up in Nazi ideology that they couldn't see reality anymore. The other thing you need to know is that Hitler had this habit of making decisions based on gut feeling rather than intelligence reports. He would literally ignore detailed analyses from his intelligence services and go with whatever felt right to him in the moment. As you can imagine, this led to some spectacular failures. All right, let's get into the first miscalculation. And this one is so foundational that it basically doomed Germany from day one. Miscalculation 1. Completely misreading Soviet industrial capacity. Here's what nobody talks about. In 1941, before invading the Soviet Union, Hitler and his economic advisors put together estimates of Soviet industrial production. They looked at how many tanks, planes, and guns the Soviets could make. And they got it catastrophically wrong. Hitler's economists estimated that the Soviet Union could produce maybe 3,000 tanks per year at most. They thought the Soviet economy was primitive, disorganized, and inefficient. And on the surface, they had reasons to think this. The Soviet Union had just gone through Stalin's purges, which killed off tons of experienced military leaders and factory managers. The Soviet performance in the Winter War against Finland in 1939 looked pretty bad. So German intelligence concluded that the USSR was a paper tiger. Here's the problem. The Soviet Union was actually producing over 11,000 tanks per year by 1942. Not 3,000, 11,000. And by 1943, that number jumped to 24,000 tanks per year. The Germans were off by a factor of 8. But it gets even worse. The German estimates for Soviet aircraft production were equally terrible. They thought the Soviets could maybe produce 10,000 planes per year. The actual number? Over 37,000 planes in 1942 alone. Why did they get this so wrong? Partly because Nazi ideology convinced them that Slavic people were inferior and couldn't possibly organize efficient industrial production. They genuinely believed that Soviet workers were too stupid and unmotivated to run modern factories. This racist assumption meant they dismissed intelligence reports that contradicted their beliefs. There's a documented meeting from March 1941 where a German economic analyst tried to warn that Soviet production capacity was being underestimated. Hitler literally interrupted him and said that numbers on paper didn't matter because the Soviet system would collapse once German troops crossed the border. He believed the entire Soviet state would fall apart within 8 weeks. This miscalculation had massive consequences. German war planning for Operation Barbarossa assumed they would face a certain number of Soviet divisions, lose a certain number of their own tanks and planes, and win before Soviet industry could fully mobilize. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong. When German forces started encountering way more Soviet tanks than expected, and when those tanks kept coming month after month, the entire plan fell apart. By late 1941, German generals were sending panicked reports back to Berlin saying they were facing Soviet units that weren't supposed to exist, according to German intelligence. Fresh divisions kept appearing on the front lines. New tank models like the T-34 were showing up in numbers that made no sense based on German estimates. And here's the kicker. Even after it became obvious that the initial estimates were completely wrong, Hitler refused to update his worldview. He kept insisting that Soviet production numbers were propaganda and that the USSR was about to collapse any day now. This denial meant Germany never properly adjusted its strategy to account for the reality of Soviet industrial might. Miscalculation 2. Declaring war on America for literally no reason. Okay, this one is absolutely bonkers. On December 11th, 1941, just 4 days after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States. And there was no reason for him to do this. None. Zero. Zilch. Let me explain why this was so stupid. The United States had just been attacked by Japan. American public opinion was furious at Japan, not Germany. President Roosevelt was having trouble convincing Americans to get involved in the European war. Most Americans wanted to focus entirely on fighting Japan in the Pacific. Hitler had this incredible opportunity to just stay quiet and let America focus all its energy on the other side of the world. But instead, he declared war on America. And by doing so, he gave Roosevelt exactly what he needed. Suddenly, Roosevelt could justify sending millions of American troops to Europe. American factories, which were already the most productive in the world, could now fully dedicate themselves to destroying Germany. Now, you might think Hitler had some strategic reason for this. Maybe he was honoring some agreement with Japan? Nope. The Tripartite Pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan only required mutual defense if one of them was attacked. Japan wasn't attacked. Japan was the attacker. So Hitler had zero obligation to do anything. Some historians argue that Hitler thought America would declare war on Germany eventually anyway, so he might as well do it first. But this logic makes no sense. Every day that America stayed out of the European war was a day where German U-boats weren't being hunted by the American Navy, where German cities weren't being bombed by American planes, where German soldiers weren't facing American troops. There's evidence that Hitler made this decision in a fit of emotion. He was angry about American support for Britain through the Lend-Lease program. He was frustrated that American ships were helping escort convoys across the Atlantic. And in his mind, declaring war would somehow show American strength and resolve. In reality, it was possibly the single dumbest strategic decision of the entire war. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later wrote that when he heard about the declaration of war on America, he immediately knew Germany would lose. He understood what American industrial capacity meant. America could outproduce Germany in every category: tanks, planes, ships, trucks, ammunition, everything. And now all of that production would be aimed directly at destroying Germany. Within 2 years of Hitler's declaration, over 1 million American troops were fighting in Europe. American bombers were turning German cities into rubble. American factories were producing so many weapons that they were literally giving them away to other Allied nations because America had more than enough for itself. All of this could have been avoided if Hitler had just kept his mouth shut for a few more months. But his ego and his emotional decision-making led to one of history's greatest self-owns. Miscalculation number 3, the catastrophic fuel calculations. This is one of those mistakes that sounds technical and boring, but actually changed everything. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union while Germany was desperately short on oil. And when I say desperately short, I mean Germany was running out of fuel for its tanks and planes in the middle of active combat operations. Here's the situation. Germany had no significant domestic oil production. They were getting oil from Romania, some from Hungary, and producing synthetic fuel from coal at a bunch of factories. But all of this combined wasn't nearly enough to sustain a major war on multiple fronts. Before invading the Soviet Union, German economic planners calculated how much fuel they would need for the operation. They estimated that if they could capture the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus region quickly, Germany would have all the fuel it needed. The plan was to launch the invasion, race down to capture the oil fields around Baku and Grozny, and solve Germany's fuel problem forever. Except they made some absolutely terrible assumptions. First, they assumed they could capture these oil fields quickly. We're talking about oil fields that were over 1,000 miles from the German starting positions. Second, they assumed the oil fields would be captured intact. They somehow thought the Soviets would just leave these incredibly valuable strategic resources sitting there ready to use. In reality, the Soviets had detailed plans to destroy the oil infrastructure if it was about to be captured. They did this successfully in multiple locations. Third, and this is the really stupid part, they didn't account for how much fuel they would use up getting to the oil fields in the first place. The German army, in 1941, needed tens of thousands of gallons of fuel every single day just to keep moving. The trucks, the tanks, the planes, the motorcycles, all of it guzzled fuel constantly. By the time German forces got anywhere near the Caucasus in 1942, they had burned through so much fuel that they were running on empty. There are reports from the summer of 1942 where German tank divisions were literally stuck in place because they had no fuel. Tanks that were mechanically fine, with full ammunition loads, ready to fight. But they couldn't move because there was no gas. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were retreating, regrouping, and preparing counterattacks. The German High Command knew about this problem before the invasion even started. There are memos from early 1941 where military economists warned that the fuel situation was critical and that invading the Soviet Union without securing alternative fuel sources first was insane. Hitler's response was basically that they would capture Soviet fuel supplies quickly enough that it wouldn't matter. This miscalculation also affected German strategy in weird ways. One of the reasons Hitler was so obsessed with capturing Stalingrad was because it was a transportation hub for oil coming up from the Caucasus. He thought that by taking Stalingrad, he could cut off Soviet oil supplies and position German forces to grab the oil fields. But he got so fixated on Stalingrad that he poured resources into a brutal urban battle instead of actually going after the oil fields themselves. By 1944, Germany was in such desperate fuel shortages that new tank designs were being shelved because there was no point building tanks if you couldn't fuel them. The Luftwaffe was grounding entire squadrons of planes. German armor divisions were getting destroyed by Allied forces partly because they couldn't maneuver properly due to fuel rationing.